After years of a secret affair and cheating on his wife with his secretary, a millionaire decides to fire her upon learning she's pregnant with his child. Ronald was a powerful and respected man. With sharp intelligence and unwavering determination, he built an empire in the food industry, becoming a millionaire by the age of 40. His impeccable demeanor and calculating gaze made him an admired figure both in business and in society. Everything in his life was meticulously planned: his image, his decisions, and even his marriage. Married for 10 years to Stephanie, an elegant and discreet woman, Ronald maintained a cold and pragmatic relationship. The absence of children was a delicate issue. Stephanie dreamed of motherhood, but Ronald treated the subject with indifference, as though it were an irrelevant detail. The marriage, though solid in the eyes of the world, was merely a convenience. Ronald's routine revolved around work, and 5 years ago he hired Rebecca, a young, efficient, and ambitious secretary. From the start, she demonstrated exceptional dedication, understanding his demands without him needing to explain them. Organized, discreet, and always attentive to the smallest details, she quickly became indispensable to his routine. At first, everything remained strictly professional, but there was something more there. Small gestures, subtle glances, a silent understanding that grew stronger day by day. Ronald never needed much to attract someone. His cold, controlled charisma had a hypnotic effect, and Rebecca, even knowing he was married, didn't take long to feel fascinated. He was powerful, determined, a man who always got what he wanted, and what he wanted at that moment was her. At first, everything happened carefully. Ronald could not afford mistakes, and Rebecca, aware of the risk, offered no resistance. The relationship started subtly, small, stolen moments between meetings and business trips. He was calculating, never exposing himself. But in private, he treated her with an attention that made her feel special. For Rebecca, it wasn't just an affair. She believed there was something real between them. Ronald never promised a future together, never talked about leaving Stephanie, but there were gestures that made her think he loved her. Small details that seemed genuine. He made her believe that she was different, that she wasn't just a mistress, but someone who really mattered to him. Stephanie, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the truth. She knew her husband better than anyone and knew that Ronald was never an affectionate man. But to her, that was part of his charm. His coldness, his calculating gaze, the way he handled everything without showing emotions, all of that had fascinated her from the start. She saw in him a man above human weaknesses, someone strong, impenetrable, and that made her admire him even more. At social events, they were the perfect couple. Stephanie saw other wives complaining about husbands who were passionate, full of jealousy and emotional fragility, and she felt proud to have a man like Ronald. He never showed weakness, never let anything affect him. To her, that wasn't a sign of indifference, but rather of superiority. The affair with Rebecca remained an absolute secret. Ronald never made mistakes, and Rebecca, enchanted by him, followed every rule imposed without question. Time passed, and the relationship became stable, a second hidden life that Ronald carried on without any fear. But everything changed when Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a shock. Her first thought was Ronald. How would he react? What would happen now? Deep down, a part of her believed he loved her. Perhaps this was the definitive proof. Perhaps he would finally admit what he felt. But instead of telling the truth, she was overwhelmed by fear. Ronald wasn't a sentimental man. He saw everything as a game of interests, and a child outside of marriage could be a disaster for his perfect life. If he knew, he might reject her, might push her away without hesitation. The thought of losing him terrified her, and so she lied. Rebecca let him believe the baby was from another man, At first, the lie seemed like the best option. Maybe it was a way to protect him from the scandal, to avoid cornering him. But what she didn't expect was his reaction. Ronald pulled away. He showed no anger, didn't question her, didn't ask for explanations. He simply changed. The attention that once made her feel special disappeared. The calculated words of affection ceased. The stolen moments between them became fewer and fewer, until nothing was left but the professional relationship. His indifference was a hard blow. Rebecca had never expected him to publicly acknowledge her, but she thought what they had was more than just a casual affair. She refused to believe that all of that was just a pastime for him. Ronald had said he cared, that she was important to him. Had it all been a lie? In the early days, she tried to convince herself that it was just a reflection of the situation. Maybe he needed time to process. Maybe he was trying to hide his frustration. But as the weeks passed and he continued to treat her merely as an employee, the truth became painfully clear. Ronald never loved her. It was a cruel thought, but inevitable. He had deceived her, led her on with false displays of affection, only to discard her when he no longer considered her useful. The coldness that Stephanie had always admired in him was now the same coldness that destroyed her. But as her belly grew, the lie became unsustainable. She could no longer escape the truth. Ronald needed to know, and so she made a decision. She would reveal everything. The morning began like any other for Ronald. He arrived at the headquarters of his company wearing an impeccable suit, walking down the hallways with his usual firm posture and confident gaze. Employees greeted him with respect, and he returned the greeting with a slight nod of his head, not wasting time on unnecessary interactions. Every step was measured, every gesture controlled. To everyone, Ronald was an unwavering leader, a man who dominated every aspect of his life. As he approached his office, he found Rebecca at her desk, as usual. She was typing something on the computer, and as soon as she noticed his presence, she straightened in her chair, assuming the professional posture she always maintained in front of him. "Good morning, Rebecca," Ronald said without interrupting his stride. "Good morning, Mr. Ronald," she replied in a controlled voice, but with something different, a hesitation that he noticed immediately. "What do we have for today?" he asked, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket and checking some messages. "2 meetings in the morning, one with the investors for the new project and another with the marketing team to review the campaign. After lunch, you have a meeting with the lawyers about the new acquisition and an afternoon conference with the directors." Ronald made a slight affirming motion with his head, satisfied with the day's plan. "Great. Let me know when it's time for each one," he said, already preparing to enter his office. A silence hung between them for a few moments. Rebecca took a deep breath, pressing her hands against the desk. Ronald, noticing the hesitation, looked up at her. "Is there anything else?" he asked. She moistened her lips and finally spoke. "Ronald," she said in a lower, hesitant tone. He stopped opening the door and turned to face her. The use of his name caught his attention. "What is it?" he asked, furrowing his brow. "I need to talk to you, something important, in private," she said, keeping her voice firm but with an uncertain look. Ronald looked around. The office was busy, with people walking from one side to the other. He sighed and made a slight gesture with his hand. "Come into my office when you want to talk about it," he said with little patience, and entered his office. Rebecca nodded slowly. She stayed at her desk for a few more minutes, breathing deeply, trying to gather courage. She knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. When she finally got up, her heart was pounding. With hesitant steps, she walked to Ronald's door and knocked lightly. "Who is it?" came his firm voice from inside. "It's me, Ronald. Rebecca," she said. "Come in," he ordered. She slowly opened the door and entered, closing it behind her. Ronald was seated at his desk looking at the computer screen. When he raised his eyes to her, he gestured for her to speak. "What is it?" he asked, going straight to the point. Rebecca took a deep breath. "It's about my pregnancy," she said, trying not to show her nervousness. Ronald raised an eyebrow and leaned slightly back in his chair. He made a brief gesture with his hand, indicating for her to sit. "I figured this moment would come. You're quite far along, so you must be here to discuss your maternity leave," he said in a pragmatic tone. Rebecca swallowed hard. "No, actually that's not it," she said, her voice softer. Ronald furrowed his brow. "Then what is it?" he asked, crossing his arms. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation about to unfold. The air seemed denser around her, and her heart was beating erratically. Each passing second made the situation more unbearable, and she knew there was no turning back. She took a deep breath, feeling her sweaty hands, and finally uttered the words she had feared. "The baby. The baby is yours, Ronald," she said, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Ronald remained motionless. He didn't blink, didn't react. He just stared at her as if he hadn't understood what she had just said. His eyes, usually sharp and controlled, now seemed empty, lost in momentary confusion. Then, slowly, his expression changed. What had been disbelief turned into something darker. "What?" he said, his voice low, laden with disbelief and danger. Rebecca felt her whole body tremble. "The baby is yours. I lied before. I said it was from another man because I thought that it would be better that way." Ronald blinked several times, trying to process. His face hardened, his jaw muscles tensed, and the silence was replaced by heavy and dangerous breathing. "You're telling me you lied to me this whole time?" he asked, his voice still low but full of something that made Rebecca feel a chill run down her spine. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out. Suddenly, Ronald slammed his hand on the desk, making the objects on it jump with the impact. "Answer me!" he shouted, his fury exploding all at once. Rebecca recoiled in her chair, tears already welling in her eyes. Yes, I lied because I was scared." Ronald let out a dry laugh, full of contempt. "Scared? Oh, so you thought hiding this from me and then just dropping this bomb in my face would be better?" He glared at her with pure hatred. "Do you have any idea what you've done, what you're trying to do to me?" "I don't want anything from you, Ronald. I just wanted you to know the truth," she said, her voice pleading. He laughed again, but now there was something cruel in his expression. "Oh, of course. You want me to know, but you don't want anything, right? You don't want money, you don't want status, you don't want a deal. Spare me that cheap hypocrisy." Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not that. I just wanted to be honest." Ronald's expression suddenly shifted, his fury growing even more. "Honest? Honest!" he shouted, walking toward her and leaning over the desk. "If you wanted to be honest, you would have told me this from the beginning. But no, you waited until now, until you had no choice to come here and throw this in my face. I knew you'd react like this. That's why I was scared," she sobbed, her voice trembling. Ronald took a deep breath, his eyes burning with rage. "And you think that changes anything? You think I'm going to take responsibility for this mess? You think I'm going to ruin my life because of a mistake of yours? Because that's what this baby is, Rebecca. A mistake." His words hit her like a knife in the chest. Rebecca felt her legs weaken, her body trembling. "Ronald, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He straightened up, rubbing his face as if trying to contain his rage. But then suddenly, his look turned even colder. "Listen closely to what I'm about to say," he spoke, his voice now lower but carrying something far worse than before. "You're going to disappear from my life. You're going to leave here now and never come looking for me again. You'll never tell anyone this nonsense." Rebecca's eyes widened, her heart racing. I won't tell anyone, Ronald. I just wanted you to know, she said, with a thread of hope that he would calm down. But he only smiled, and that smile sent a chill down her spine. Better not say anything, Rebecca, because if you open your mouth to tell anyone this story— He paused, his gaze dark and cruel. You'll regret it bitterly, you and that child. She felt her stomach drop. What? She stammered, unable to believe what she was hearing. Ronald leaned even closer, his voice a menacing whisper. I'm telling you that if you try to screw me over, I'll end you. No matter where you go, who you talk to. I can ruin your career, make you disappear, turn your life into hell. And as for that child— He paused again, his look dark and threatening. If you want to keep them safe, you better forget I exist. Tears ran down Rebecca's face, her breath shallow, her chest tight from the panic consuming her. You wouldn't do that, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Ronald just smirked. Try your luck. The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of his words crashed down on her like a brutal blow. Ronald wasn't a man who made empty threats. If he said he could harm her, it was because he truly could. Weak and drained, Rebecca stood up, her legs shaking. I'm leaving, she said, her voice faltering. Good idea, Ronald replied, sitting back down as if the conversation had been just another passing inconvenience. And if you want to keep your peace, I hope I never hear from you again. She turned and left the room, tears streaming uncontrollably. She walked down the hall, head down, swallowing her sobs as best she could. But inside, she knew her life would never be the same. When the door closed behind her, Ronald stayed seated for a few moments, staring into nothing. He breathed deeply, clenching his fists. His perfect world had been threatened, and he wouldn't let that happen, no matter what he had to do. Rebecca left Ronald's office carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her body trembled, her mind confused, and her eyes burned from the tears that wouldn't stop falling. She barely registered the faces of her colleagues as she walked back to her desk. She sat down heavily, trying to catch her breath, but the knot in her throat made it hard to breathe properly. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and the silence around her only made everything worse. The room, the hallways, everything seemed to spin. The elevator door opened and firm footsteps approached. Rebecca tried to hide, wiping her face, but it was too late. "Rebecca?" The soft, formal voice of Amanda from HR interrupted her stupor. Rebecca looked up and saw the woman standing before her, holding a brown envelope. "Mr. Ronald asked me to speak with you." Rebecca felt a chill of fear. "He's informed me that you're fired." The words hit Rebecca like a punch to the stomach. "What?" Her voice faltered, as though she was struggling to process what she had just heard. Amanda hesitated when she saw Rebecca's red, swollen eyes, but maintained a professional demeanor. "I just came to bring you the documents to formalize your departure. He asked that you sign them and leave the company as soon as possible." Rebecca stood still for a few seconds, blinking rapidly as though trying to process the information. Her chest tightened. Her job, her career, all thrown away in a matter of minutes. Without saying anything, she took the papers with trembling hands and signed where Amanda indicated. When finished, she handed the documents back without looking at the woman. "I'm sorry," Amanda murmured before walking away. But Rebecca didn't respond. She just took her few belongings, her coat, a folder with notes, and a small picture frame with a photo of her and her mother, and left the company without looking back. The walk to the parking lot felt endless. Her feet were heavy, her head spinning, and her heart pounded so hard she felt like it might explode at any moment. She got into the car, threw her bag onto the passenger seat, and sat there, motionless, for a few seconds. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe deeply, but the despair was suffocating her. With trembling hands, she started the car and drove home in complete silence. Every turn she made seemed automatic, as if her body were on autopilot while her mind kept repeating Ronald's words. "This child means nothing to me. Nothing. If you open your mouth, you'll regret it. If you want to keep this child safe, you better forget I exist." When she got home, she locked the door and went straight to her room. She lay down on the bed and let out the sobs she had been holding back for the past few minutes. She hugged the pillow, crying uncontrollably. Her whole life had crumbled in just a few hours. Time passed uncertainly. She didn't know how many hours she cried, but at some point, exhaustion took over, and she fell asleep right there, with tears still soaking her pillow. The following days were a blur. Rebecca refused to leave the house. She spent the days lying down, with no energy for anything. She barely ate, barely slept. Ronald's threats echoed in her head, mixed with the pain of rejection. She felt anger. Anger for having believed in him. Anger for having loved him. Anger for being so naive, thinking Ronald could be different. But what could she do? Just accept this? Ronald's words still echoed in her mind, the contempt in his eyes, the rage in his voice, the cold and threatening tone when he said that if she spoke, she and the baby would suffer the consequences. She felt fear, a suffocating fear that paralyzed her. What if he really followed through on his threats? Ronald was a powerful man, influential. He could destroy her reputation, her life, maybe even worse. The thought of confronting him seemed impossible, but at the same time, the indignation grew inside her like an uncontrollable fire. Ronald wasn't just a cold man, he was cruel. He was a monster who didn't even hesitate before denying his own child, threatening her with no trace of humanity. Rebecca placed her hands on her belly, feeling the curve of her pregnancy. "And what do I do now?" she whispered to herself, tears filling her eyes again. She spent 3 more days locked in the house, unable to make a decision. Each time she thought about telling someone, fear consumed her, but each time she thought about the future, she became angry with herself for staying silent. She couldn't spend the rest of her life in fear. Her baby didn't deserve to live in hiding, unprotected. She needed advice. The only person she trusted was her mother, Angela. But what if her mother judged her? What if she said she deserved this? She felt a tightness in her chest at the thought of Angela's disappointed eyes. Her mother had always taught her not to depend on anyone, to be strong, to never put herself in vulnerable situations. She knew a scolding was coming, but she needed to hear it. The next morning, she made a decision. She forced herself out of bed, went to the bathroom, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and sunken. She barely recognized herself. She washed her face, letting the cold water soothe the accumulated exhaustion. She dried off slowly and took a deep breath. "It's going to be okay," she told herself, even though she didn't believe it. She dressed simply, grabbed her car keys, and left the house for the first time in days. The drive to her mother's house felt longer than usual. Every kilometer she drove increased the anxiety in her chest. When she finally parked in front of Angela's house, her fingers trembled as she held the key. She took a deep breath and got out of the car. She walked up to the door, hesitated for a moment, but finally rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and Angela appeared. Her mother's eyes widened when she saw Rebecca. "Daughter, my God, what happened to you?" she said, holding Rebecca's shoulders and scanning her with a concerned look. Rebecca tried to force a smile but couldn't. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Angela immediately knew something was wrong. Her expression became more serious. "Come in right now," she said, gently pulling her daughter inside. They walked to the living room. Rebecca sat on the couch and Angela sat next to her, not taking her eyes off her. "Now tell me, what happened?" Rebecca swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what she was about to say, and then she told everything. From the beginning of the affair with Ronald, the fact that he was married, and she knew it. She talked about how she fell in love, how she believed he loved her too. She talked about the pregnancy, the lie she told out of fear, and his rejection. Then came the worst part. She told her mother about the explosion of Ronald's fury, the insults, the threats. She spoke of the firing, the humiliation, the fear she felt. When she finished, Angela remained silent for a few seconds, just staring at her daughter. Then she took a deep breath, and her expression hardened. "I can't believe what I'm hearing, Rebecca," she said, her voice harsh. Rebecca lowered her head, feeling the weight of her mother's disappointment. "You really thought none of this would have consequences? You got involved with a married man and expected what? That he would leave his wife and build a family with you?" Rebecca felt the tears coming back. "I loved him, Mom. I thought he loved me too." Angela shook her head, visibly irritated. "Love? Love, Rebecca? Since when does love involve betrayal? Since when can a man who has a wife, who keeps a marriage facade, offer real love?" Rebecca sobbed, feeling even worse. "I know I made a mistake, Mom." Angela sighed and rubbed her face, frustrated. "It's not just about you, Rebecca. It's about this child you're carrying. Do you have any idea of the responsibility you now have? This baby needs protection, and Ronald made it clear he will offer nothing but threats." That sentence hit Rebecca like a shock. Angela took her daughter's hands and looked her in the eyes. "You need to be strong now, Rebecca. I know you're scared, but staying silent is not an option. Ronald can't just threaten you and get away with it." Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to hold back the sobs. "But what do I do, Mom? I'm afraid of what he might do." Angela squeezed her hands firmly. "First, you're going to the police and reporting him. You're going to tell everything, every threat, every word he said to you. This needs to be recorded." Rebecca hesitated. "And then?" "Then you're going to his wife. This woman has the right to know who the man she sleeps with every night really is. You may have been wrong to get involved with him, but now you need to do what's right. You need to take off his mask." Rebecca felt a chill. "Do you think she'll believe me?" Angela sighed. "Maybe not right away, but you need to try. It's not just about exposing Ronald. It's about protecting yourself, protecting your baby. You can't let him think he can silence you." Rebecca stayed silent for a long moment. She was scared, terrified, but her mother was right. If she stayed silent, Ronald would win, and if he won, nothing would stop him from going even further. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, she felt determined. She stood up, wiped her tears, and looked at Angela with determination. "You're right. I'm going to do it." Angela smiled and held her hand. "I'm with you, my daughter. Always." With one last hug from her mother, Rebecca left the house with firm purpose. Ronald thought he would get away with it, but he was wrong. Rebecca left her mother's house with a firm resolve. Her hands still trembled lightly, and fear still lingered in her heart, but determination was stronger. She drove to the police station, her body tense, her mind reliving everything that had happened in the past few days. When she arrived at the police building, she hesitated for a moment. The fear of Ronald was still real, but then she placed her hand on her belly and took a deep breath. Her child needed her. She could no longer hide. She entered the police station and walked to the front desk. A police officer with a neutral expression looked at her. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Rebecca moistened her lips, trying to keep her voice firm. "I need to file a report." "What type of report?" he asked, picking up a form. She swallowed hard. "Threats and coercion. The officer looked up at her, evaluating her expression. "Come with me, please." She was taken to a reserved room where a more experienced investigator sat across from her and began asking questions. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Rebecca took a deep breath and began to tell everything. She told everything. From the beginning of the affair with Ronald, the fact that he was married, the pregnancy, and how she, out of fear, had lied about the father of the baby. She told about his rejection, and finally the day she revealed the truth. She described in detail Ronald's explosive fury, the shouting, the insults, the humiliation. And then came the worst part. "He threatened me," she said, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. The investigator leaned slightly forward. "How did he threaten you?" "He said that if I told anyone, my baby and I would suffer the consequences. That he could make me disappear from the market, ruin my life. But the worst, he looked me in the eyes and said that if I wanted to keep my baby safe, I'd better forget he existed." The officer was silent for a few seconds, recording everything. "This is serious, Miss Rebecca. Are you willing to formalize this report?" She hesitated for only a moment before affirming with conviction, "Yes, I want this to be recorded." She went through the bureaucratic process, signed the documents, and heard the officer's instructions about the investigation's progress. Before leaving, the investigator looked at her seriously. "If he tries to contact you, if he does anything that seems like retaliation, let us know immediately. We'll investigate this seriously." Rebecca nodded and left the station feeling a mix of fear and relief. But her mission was not yet complete. Now it was time to tell Stephanie everything. She drove to Ronald's house, already knowing he would be at work at that hour. She never intended to confront both of them at once. She knew that if she wanted a chance to be heard, she needed to speak directly to Stephanie. She parked the car at the entrance and rang the doorbell. Her heart raced. Hesitation took over her for a moment. Was she really ready for this? Her fingers trembled, and a lump tightened in her throat. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering courage. The memory of her last conversation with Ronald flashed in her mind. His fury, his contempt, his threats. She took a deep breath. This had to be done. The sound of footsteps came from the other side of the door. The latch turned, and then the door opened, revealing Stephanie. She looked immaculate as always, wearing an elegant blouse and tailored pants. Her face showed surprise when she saw Rebecca standing there. "Rebecca," she said, furrowing her brow, "what are you doing here? Did something happen to Ronald?" Rebecca felt a tightness in her chest. She didn't know. "We need to talk, Stephanie. It's important." The expression on Ronald's wife's face grew slightly suspicious, but her education and poised demeanor prevented her from being rude. "Of course, come in." Rebecca stepped inside and followed Stephanie to the living room, a spacious and immaculately organized area. The entire house was flawless, reflecting the image of perfection that Ronald had always cultivated. But beneath all the luxury and stability, there was a lie. Stephanie sat down in an armchair and crossed her legs elegantly. "So what is this about?" Rebecca felt her mouth go dry. She needed to choose her words carefully. "Stephanie, I don't work for Ronald anymore." The woman furrowed her brows. "What? He fired you? But why?" Rebecca pressed her hands to her lap. "Because I'm pregnant with his child." The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie's face lost all color instantly. She froze, blinking a few times as if trying to process those words. "What?" Her voice came out in a whisper. "Ronald and I had an affair for the past few years. I know it's unforgivable, but I loved him, and he said he loved me too." Stephanie's eyes widened, and she backed up a little, as though feeling disgusted to be near Rebecca. You slept with my husband?" "Yes," Rebecca said with difficulty. Stephanie laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was bitter, frustrated. "Is this some kind of joke?" Do you want money? Because if that's what this is about, you can leave now. I don't want money, Stephanie, Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady. Stephanie abruptly stood up. And why the hell should I believe you? She started pacing, agitated. You want me to trust the word of the woman who destroyed my marriage? This doesn't make sense. Rebecca sighed, feeling her chest tighten. I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I'm telling you the truth. I was naive. I fell in love with him and believed the lies he told me. I knew he was married, but he always said our relationship was special. Stephanie stopped and looked directly at her. There were tears in her eyes. And you thought this was love. Her voice lowered, but it was filled with pain. My God, Rebecca, he used you. Rebecca felt a lump tighten in her throat. I know that now, but back then I believed it. Stephanie wiped her face as though trying to hold back despair. This can't be true. Ronald, he can be cold sometimes, but he would never do something like this. Rebecca took a deep breath. Stephanie, he threatened me. Ronald's wife stood motionless. What? When I told him about the pregnancy, he was furious. He insulted me, humiliated me, and kicked me out of the company, but the worst wasn't that. He said that if I opened my mouth, my baby and I would pay dearly for it. He said he could ruin my life. Stephanie's hands began to shake. No, she whispered, as though trying to deny it to herself. He looked me in the eyes and said that if I wanted to keep my baby safe, I'd better forget he existed. A tear ran down Stephanie's face. She no longer doubted. I spent 10 years with a man who never loved me. I defended him, believed in him, built a life with him. She laughed, but it was a shaky, desperate laugh. And in the end, it was all a lie. Rebecca stood up. I came here because you have the right to know who you married. You deserve the truth. Stephanie took a deep breath and wiped her tears. Her face changed. Now, there was not just pain. There was anger. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. And get away with it, she said, her voice now cold and controlled. She looked at Rebecca with determination. Thank you for telling me. Now, leave the rest to me. In the following days, everything began to crumble for Ronald. The first piece to fall was his marriage. Stephanie, filled with a mix of rage and humiliation, wasted no time. The day after her conversation with Rebecca, she contacted one of the most renowned and aggressive lawyers she knew and filed for divorce. But she didn't just want to separate. She wanted Ronald to pay. With years of experience in marriage and a sharp eye for his business dealings, she knew exactly where to strike. She moved quickly with the paperwork, ensuring that any financial irregularities in the company were scrutinized closely by the lawyers. At the same time, she exposed all the dirt she had uncovered. The affair, the threats against Rebecca and the baby, the cruel way he treated those who were no longer of use to him. As soon as the news leaked to the press, the scandal exploded. Newspapers and news websites began publishing articles about the downfall of the exemplary man, now revealed as an unfaithful husband and an abusive boss. The public exposure was brutal. Ronald's name became synonymous with dishonor and hypocrisy. The corporate elite, who had once praised him, began to distance themselves quickly. The business world, always mindful of reputation, saw him as a risk and started severing ties. Investors began to pull back, afraid of the negative publicity. Major contracts were cancelled. Partners who had once respected him now wanted to keep their distance from his tarnished name. But Ronald's problems didn't end there. With Rebecca's formal report and Stephanie's testimony, the police began an investigation into the threats and coercion. Authorities began looking into not just the threats against Rebecca, but also other cases of intimidation within the company. Employees who had once feared retaliation began to speak out. Reports of verbal abuse, manipulation, and psychological pressure surfaced. The company, once a symbol of success, became a battleground. Ronald tried to resist, tried to reverse the crisis, but every move he made was thwarted by a new accusation, a new piece of evidence showing his true nature. Financial damages were severe. With the boycott from clients and the loss of major investors, shares plummeted. Without support, and with his reputation ruined, Ronald tried to sell parts of the company to salvage what he could. But no one wanted to buy an empire on the brink of collapse. Stephanie ensured that the divorce was finalized in the most destructive way possible for him. She demanded a multi-million-dollar settlement, citing moral damages, infidelity, and emotional harm caused by the fake marriage. She left the marriage much richer and far more powerful. When the crisis reached its peak, Ronald was formally charged with coercion and threat, a final blow to his credibility. Now, besides being bankrupt and discredited, he faced criminal charges. The man who had once dominated business with coldness and confidence was now alone, without a wife, without allies, without money. His perfect life no longer existed. Meanwhile, Rebecca moved forward. With the support of her mother and the legal assistance she received, she managed to rebuild herself. She found a new job at a smaller company, but one where she was finally respected. She raised her son with dignity, far from the shadows of the past. She never forgot what she had gone through, but she learned that the truth always finds a way to come to light, and that not even the most powerful can escape the consequences of their actions. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.